The massive hall fell silent as Ambassador Cairo walked to the center stage. His forearms shook as he moved across the polished floor. The thousands of alien beings from across the galaxy watched him with growing concern. They had never seen the proud Velkari diplomat look so broken. Cairo had always been strong. His people were famous throughout the galaxy for their perfect minds and steady emotions. They could negotiate peace between the most angry enemies. They could solve problems that had lasted for hundreds of years. But now Cairo looked like he had seen something that changed him forever. The council leader gestured for Cairo to begin his report. The hall became so quiet that even the soft humming of the air system seemed loud. Cairo opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He tried again, and his voice cracked like he was about to cry. "I went to Earth as you commanded," he finally said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The beings in the front rows leaned forward to hear him better. "I went there to bring the humans into our council. I thought it would be simple. They are new to space travel. They seemed primitive compared to us." Cairo paused and looked around the hall. His eyes were wide and filled with something the other diplomats had never seen before. Fear mixed with wonder, mixed with something else they could not name. "But they are not primitive," he continued. "They are something else entirely. Something we have never encountered before in all our years of exploring the galaxy." The council leader frowned. "What do you mean, Ambassador? Please explain your report clearly." Cairo laughed, but it was not a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone who had learned something terrible. "The humans," he said, "are dangerous, but not in the way we thought. They do not have the strongest weapons. They do not have the biggest ships. They have something much worse." The audience began to murmur among themselves. What could be worse than superior weapons? What could frighten a Velkari diplomat so badly? "They have stories," Cairo said, and his voice grew stronger. "They have memories. They have this thing they call history, and they carry it with them everywhere they go." Many of the aliens looked confused. Stories were just entertainment. History was just old events that had already happened. What could be dangerous about that? "I met a human named Dongmin," Cairo continued. "He was just an ordinary person working in their government offices. He invited me to his home for what they call dinner. He showed me pictures, books full of pictures of his family, his friends, his life. The aliens waited for more. This did not sound dangerous at all. But then he showed me other pictures," Cairo said, and his voice began to shake again. "Pictures of wars. Pictures of suffering. Pictures of terrible things that happened to his people. And he told me stories about them. He told me about his grandfather who lived through a war that killed millions of people. He told me about his grandmother who survived when her city was destroyed." Still, the audience did not understand. Why would showing pictures of old wars affect a trained diplomat? Because Cairo said, and now tears were running down his face. "Because after he showed me all the terrible things that happened to his family." He smiled. He smiled and told me how his grandfather rebuilt his life, how his grandmother found love again, how they made a beautiful family from the ashes of their broken world. The hall was completely silent now. Everyone was listening carefully, trying to understand what had broken their best diplomat. He showed me how humans take their worst moments and turn them into strength. Cairo continued, "How they remember everything, the good and the bad, and somehow use it all to become better. He showed me children playing in parks that were once battlefields. He showed me schools built where prisons used to stand. He showed me people who should hate each other working together to build something new." Cairo stopped talking and covered his face with two of his hands. The other two hands hung at his sides, shaking. "I do not understand it," he whispered. "How can they be so cruel and so kind at the same time? How can they remember such terrible things and still have hope? How can they forgive their enemies and still be ready to fight? How can they cry for their losses and celebrate their victories in the same breath?" The council leader stood up slowly. "Ambassador Cairo, you are clearly disturbed by your mission. Perhaps you need medical attention." "No," Cairo said sharply. "You do not understand. I am not sick. I am not broken in the way you think I am changed. The humans, they change you just by being near them. They make you see things differently. They make you question everything you thought you knew about life, about strength, about what it means to be alive. The murmuring in the hall grew louder. Some aliens were frightened, others were curious. A few looked like they wanted to visit Earth themselves to see what could affect a Velkari so strongly. We decided to send another diplomat, the council leader announced. We sent Zeph-Ara of the Nethys people. She has the ability to read minds and emotions perfectly. She would not be fooled by human tricks. Cairo laughed again, that same broken sound. She came back worse than me, he said. She came back talking about beautiful monsters and impossible contradictions. She came back saying that humans make her feel things she has no words for. She came back changed just like me. The hall erupted in confused voices. What kind of beings were these humans? What power did they have that could break the minds of trained diplomats? How could primitive people who had just learned to travel between stars have such an effect on advanced civilizations? The council leader called for quiet. When the hall was silent again, he looked at Cairo with serious eyes. What do you recommend, Ambassador? What should we do about the humans? Cairo was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. Stay away from them, he said. Unless you want to be changed, unless you want to see yourself and your people and your whole way of life in a completely different way, unless you want to question everything you believe about right and wrong and strength and weakness, stay away from Earth. But even as he said it, Cairo knew it was too late. Word about the humans was already spreading through the galaxy. Some species would avoid human space out of fear. Others would be drawn to discover what could break even the strongest minds. The humans would continue expanding into the galaxy, completely unaware of the effect they were having on everyone they met, and somewhere in the back of the Great Hall, a young alien diplomat named Thanix listened to every word, and began to wonder what it would be like to meet these strange beings called humans. He had been a diplomat for 800 years. He had seen everything the galaxy had to offer. He was sure he could handle whatever had broken Cairo and Zeph-Ara. He was completely wrong. Thanix stood in his private chambers aboard the diplomatic ship as it approached Earth. His reflection stared back at him from the polished metal wall. 800 years of experience had taught him that every species could be understood if you knew the right approach. He had negotiated peace between the fire-breathing Corvani and the ice-dwelling Frostlings. He had helped the machine minds of Nexus Prime learn to communicate with organic life forms. He had even convinced the warlike, savage clans to join the galactic community. The reports about broken diplomats did not worry him. Cairo and Zeph-Ara were good at their jobs, but they were young. They had not seen what he had seen. They did not have his deep understanding of alien psychology. Every species had their tricks, their ways of confusing outsiders. The humans were probably just very good at emotional manipulation. The ship entered Earth's atmosphere and landed in a city the humans called Sol. Thanix stepped out of his transport and immediately noticed how different everything looked. Human buildings were strange mixtures of old and new styles. Some structures looked ancient while others gleamed with modern technology. The air smelled of many different things, cooking fuel, growing plants, and something else he could not identify. A small group of humans waited for him at the landing pad. The leader was a young female who stepped forward with a bright smile on her face. Her hair was dark, and her eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity. She moved with confidence, but also with a warmth that surprised him. "Welcome to Earth, Ambassador Thanix," she said, bowing slightly in what he recognized as a human gesture of respect. "I am He-Jin, your liaison during your stay here." "We are honored to have such an experienced diplomat visit our world." Thanix studied her carefully. She seemed ordinary enough. Young by his standards, probably not even 50 years old. Her clothes were simple and practical. Her voice was steady and sincere. Nothing about her suggested the kind of dangerous influence that had supposedly broken two trained diplomats. "Thank you for the welcome," he replied using the translation device all diplomats carried. "I look forward to learning about your species and discussing your place in the galactic community." He-Jin led him through the city streets, pointing out various buildings and explaining their purposes. Thanix noticed how the humans moved around each other. Some walked quickly, with serious expressions while others strolled slowly enjoying their surroundings. Children played in small parks while elderly humans sat on benches watching them. It all seemed very normal, very predictable. They entered a large building that Heijin explained was their diplomatic center. Inside the walls were covered with pictures and displays showing human history. Thaynix glanced at them briefly, noting images of wars and celebrations of destruction and construction of sadness and joy. It was a typical species display showing both their achievements and their struggles. "Let me introduce you to my colleague," Heijin said as they walked down a long corridor. "This is Subin, our specialist in human historical studies. She will help you understand our background." Subin was older than Heijin, with gray streaks in her hair and lines around her eyes that suggested she spent a lot of time thinking about serious matters. She greeted Thaynix with the same warm smile, but her eyes held a depth that made him slightly uncomfortable. "I understand you want to know about human nature," she said as they settled into a comfortable meeting room. "I think the best way to understand us is to look at our history. Would you like to see some records?" Thaynix agreed, thinking this would be routine. Every species had their historical records. Usually they showed their greatest victories and tried to hide their worst failures. It was standard diplomatic procedure to review them. Subin activated a large display screen and began showing images of human conflicts. Thainy expected to see glorified battles and heroic victories. Instead, he saw something that confused him. The humans showed everything. The terrible defeats alongside the great victories, the moments of cowardice next to acts of courage, the times when they failed to live up to their ideals right beside the times when they exceeded them. "Look at this," Subin said, pointing to an image of a destroyed city. "This was our capital during a great war. Millions of people died here. The destruction was complete." Thaynix nodded grimly. Every species had such disasters in their past. It was unfortunate, but not unusual. "But watch what happened next." Subin continued. The screen showed the same city. Years later, gleaming buildings rose where ruins had been parks and gardens. Filled spaces where rubble had laid, children played where bodies had fallen. They rebuilt, Thaynix observed, still not seeing what was supposed to be so disturbing. "Yes, but look closer." Subin zoomed in on a particular area. "See that memorial? It stands exactly where the worst destruction happened. The humans built a monument to remember their loss right in the middle of their new construction. They did not hide their tragedy. They made it part of their recovery." Thaynix frowned slightly. This was unusual. Most species preferred to forget their disasters and focus on their successes, and see this building. Subin continued. "It is a school where children learn about the war. They learn about the mistakes that led to it. They learn about the people who died. They learn about the people who survived. They learn about what they must do to prevent it from happening again." This made Thaynix even more uncomfortable. Why would a species want to constantly remind themselves of their failures? Why not focus on their achievements and let the past stay buried? Because Subin said, as if reading his thoughts, "We learned that forgetting our mistakes means we will repeat. Then we learned that our worst moments can teach us to be better. We learned that pain and joy are both part of life, and we need both to grow." Over the following days, Heijin and Subin showed Thaynix more of human society. He visited hospitals, where humans cared for their sick and injured. He saw schools where children learned not just facts but also kindness and empathy. He watched courts where humans tried to balance justice with mercy. He observed factories where former enemies now worked side by side. Each experience added to his growing confusion. The humans seemed to do everything backwards. They embraced their contradictions instead of resolving them. They remembered their failures instead of forgetting them. They showed weakness alongside strength. They admitted their mistakes while still claiming to be good people. The breaking point came when Heijin invited him to meet her grandfather. An old human named Tai-Ho welcomed Thaynix into his small home and served him a warm drink called tea. The old man's hands shook slightly as he poured the tea, but his eyes were clear and kind. Tai-Ho began telling stories about his life during a terrible war. He described losing his family, watching his friends die, seeing his country destroyed. His voice remained calm and gentle even as he described the most horrible experiences Thanex had ever heard. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of ending with bitterness or anger, Teho smiled. He showed Thanex pictures of his new family, the children and grandchildren he had raised after the war. He talked about his small garden where he grew vegetables for his neighbors. He spoke about the friends he had made from among people who had once been his enemies. "Is this possible?" Thanex finally asked, his voice shaking. "How can you remember such terrible things and still smile? How can you forgive people who hurt you? How can you find joy after experiencing such pain?" Teho looked at him with those kind, old eyes and said something that shattered everything. Thanex thought he knew about life. "Because, young friend, that is what it means to be alive. To hold all of it, the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss, to let it all make you stronger instead of breaking you apart. That is the human way." That night, Thanex sat alone in his quarters, staring out at the human city lights. His 800 years of experience suddenly felt meaningless. He had never encountered a species that embraced contradiction as a strength. He had never met beings who could transform their worst experiences into wisdom. He had never seen people who could love their enemies while still being ready to fight them. He began to understand why Cairo and Zephyra had come back broken. The humans did not break people with tricks or manipulation. They broke them with truth, with a way of living that forced observers to question everything they thought they knew about existence itself. And as he sat there watching the humans go about their evening routines, Thanex realized he would never be the same again. Thanex could not sleep that night. The old human's words kept echoing in his mind. That is what it means to be alive, to hold all of it, the good and the bad. He had never heard such a simple explanation for something so complex. His own people, the Kelthani, had always believed in order and logic. They separated their emotions into neat categories. They dealt with problems by finding the most efficient solution. They did not mix joy with sorrow or love with pain. The next morning, Haijin found him sitting in the garden outside his quarters, staring at nothing. His usually perfect posture was slumped and his clothes were wrinkled from a sleepless night. She approached carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "You all right, Ambassador?" she asked gently. "You look troubled." Thanex looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. "I do not understand your people," he said quietly. "My species has studied thousands of different life forms. We have learned to predict behavior, to understand motivations, to find patterns, but you humans, you break all the rules." Haijin sat down beside him on the stone bench. The morning air was cool and birds sang in the nearby trees. "Would you like to understand us better?" she asked. "Perhaps I can show you more of our world against his better judgment," Thanex agreed. He followed Haijin through the city streets, watching the humans go about their daily lives. They stopped at a school where children were learning about history. The teacher was showing them pictures of a great war that had happened decades ago. Thanex expected the lesson to be about victory and defeat, about heroes and villains. Instead, the teacher talked about choices. She explained how ordinary people had made both good and bad decisions during the war. She showed how some humans had been cruel while others had been kind. She taught the children that they too would face such choices in their lives. One small child raised her hand and asked, "Teacher, why do people do bad things?" The teacher smiled sadly and said, "Because people are not perfect, little one. We all have the ability to be good or bad. The important thing is to try to choose good even when it is difficult, even when we are scared or angry or hurt." Thanex felt something shift inside his mind. His people would never teach their young about moral ambiguity. They would give clear rules about right and wrong. They would not burden children with the knowledge that good people could do bad things after. The school they visited a hospital where Haijin introduced him to a doctor named Sunja. She was treating patients who had been injured in an accident. The doctor worked with intense focus, saving lives without asking who the patients were or what they had done. But what struck Thanex most was a conversation he overheard between Sunja and a nurse. They were discussing a patient who had caused the accident while driving under the influence of alcohol. The man had killed 2 people and injured many others. He will recover, the doctor said, checking his medical chart. Then he will face justice for what he did. The nurse nodded but looked troubled. It is hard to save someone who has done such terrible things. Soonja paused in her work and looked at the nurse with compassionate eyes. That is exactly when we must save them, she said. When someone has done wrong, they need healing more than anyone else. We cannot give up on people just because they have made terrible choices. Thanik staggered backward as if he had been struck. His people would have let such a person die. They would have called it justice. They would have said that some actions were unforgivable. But these humans, they saved everyone, even people who had caused great harm. Later that day, He-jin took him to a court where a trial was taking place. A man named Jae-sung sat in the witness stand telling his story. His family had been killed by a drunk driver, the same type of person the doctor had been treating. The man who had destroyed his life sat only a few meters away. Thanik expected to see hatred and anger. He expected demands for revenge. Instead, Jae-sung spoke with quiet dignity about his loss. He talked about missing his wife and children, about the hole in his life that would never be filled. But then he said something that broke Thanik completely. I do not want this man to die. He said, looking directly at the person who had destroyed his family. I want him to live. I want him to get help. I want him to become someone who would never hurt another family the way he hurt mine. I want him to carry the weight of what he did and use it to become better. The courtroom was silent. Everyone was listening to this man who had lost everything, yet still chose mercy over vengeance, because if I let hatred consume me, Jae-sung continued, then he has not just killed my family, he has killed me too, and I will not give him that power. Thanik ran from the courtroom. He could not breathe. He could not think. His carefully ordered mind was falling apart. Everything he had believed about justice, about punishment, about the nature of right and wrong was crumbling. He found himself in a small park where children were playing. Their laughter echoed. Off the trees, he sat on a bench and put his head in his hands, trying to make sense of what he had seen. He-jin found him there hours later. She sat beside him without speaking for a long time. Finally, she said, "You are beginning to understand us." "No," Thanik whispered. "I am beginning to not understand anything. How can you forgive people who hurt you? How can you choose mercy when you have the right to choose revenge? How can you love your enemies while still being ready to fight them? Because," He-jin said gently, "that is what makes us human. We learned long ago that holding on to anger and hatred only hurts us. We learned that everyone is capable of both good and evil, including ourselves. We learned that if we want to build a better world, we have to be willing to help even people who have wronged us. But how do you live with the contradictions?" Thanik asked. "How do you hold love and hate, hope and despair, strength and weakness, all at the same time?" He-jin smiled and looked at the playing children. "We do not try to resolve the contradictions," she said. "We embrace them. We let them make us complex and interesting and real. We let them teach us empathy and wisdom and compassion. We let them show us that life is not simple, but that does not mean it is not beautiful." That evening, He-jin invited Thanik to her home for dinner. Her family welcomed him with the same warmth they would show any friend. Her brother Minho was there, a soldier who had recently returned from a peacekeeping mission in another country. Minho spoke honestly about the things he had seen, the violence and suffering that still haunted his dreams. But he also talked about the small moments of hope, the children who had smiled at him, the families who had been reunited, the communities that had started to rebuild. "I carry all of it with me," Minho said, "the bad and the good. It makes me sad sometimes, but it also makes me grateful. It makes me want to work harder for peace. It makes me want to protect people who cannot protect themselves." Thanik realized that night that he had been changed forever. He could never go back to his old way of thinking. He could never again see the universe as a simple place where problems had clear solutions, where people were either good or bad, where strength meant avoiding pain and weakness. The humans had shown him that true strength came from facing pain and growing from it, that wisdom came from acknowledging your flaws and working to overcome them. That love was not the absence of anger, but the choice to act with kindness, even when you felt anger. As he sat with Heijin's family sharing their food and their stories, Thaynix understood why diplomats came back from Earth broken. The humans did not break people with weapons or tricks, they broke them with truth. They forced observers to confront the full complexity of existence and to choose how they would respond to that complexity. He would return to the council, but he would never be the same. The humans had taught him that being alive meant holding contradictions and finding strength in them, that being good meant choosing to act with compassion, even when you had the right to act with anger. And for the first time in his 800 years of life, Thaynix felt truly alive. Thaynix stood before the Galactic Council chamber, but this time he was the one giving the report. His 800 years of diplomatic experience meant nothing now. The ancient being who had been confident in his ability to understand any species was gone. In his place stood someone who had been fundamentally changed by contact with humanity. The council members listened in growing alarm as Thaynix described his experiences on Earth. His words carried a strange quality that made other beings uncomfortable. He spoke about contradictions as if they were beautiful. He talked about pain as if it could be a teacher. He described forgiveness as if it were a form of strength. Several council members who had never been to Earth began experiencing what the medical staff called human syndrome. They found themselves thinking about Thaynix's words long after the session ended. They started questioning their own beliefs about right and wrong. They began to wonder if their own civilizations had been missing something important. The council leader called an emergency session. The situation was getting out of control. Reports about humanity were spreading through the galaxy like a disease. Some species were avoiding human space entirely. Others were sending secret expeditions to observe humans from a distance. A few had even begun changing their own societies based on what they had learned about human thinking. We must contain this situation, the council leader announced. The humans appear to pose a cognitive hazard to other species. Any further contact must be carefully controlled, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Word about the strange species that broke diplomats had reached every corner of the galaxy. Some beings were terrified, others were fascinated, and a few were determined to understand exactly what made humans so different. The council established a research station at the edge of human space, far enough away to be safe but close enough to study them. The station was staffed by volunteers who understood that they might never be the same after their assignment. The research team was led by a human named Wei Ling, who had been studying alien psychology for years. She had volunteered to serve as a bridge between species to help others understand why humans had such a profound effect on alien minds. Wei Ling worked with a team of alien researchers who had specifically requested assignment to the station. Despite the risks, they wanted to understand the mystery of human influence. There was Morath, a Velkari scientist who had been fascinated by Cairo's original reports. There was Unit 7, a synthetic being who believed their artificial nature might protect them from human psychological effects. For months they observed human behavior from a distance. They watched how humans interacted with each other, how they resolved conflicts, how they built their societies. They recorded everything, trying to find patterns that might explain the human effect on other minds. The breakthrough came when Unit 7 made an unexpected discovery. The synthetic being had been analyzing human brain patterns when they noticed something unusual. Human neural activity showed a unique pattern of simultaneous, contradictory thoughts. Most species think in linear ways. Unit 7 explained to the team. When faced with a problem, they follow logical steps to reach a solution. But humans, they think in multiple directions at once. They hold opposing ideas in their mind simultaneously and somehow find creative solutions that transcend simple either-or thinking. Wei Ling nodded thoughtfully. That matches what we know about human psychology, she said. We call it cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt our thinking to new situations, to consider multiple perspectives at the same time. But Morath was confused. How is this possible? How can intelligent beings function with contradictory thoughts? Would this not cause mental instability? Not for humans, Wei Ling replied. For us, contradictions are not problems to be solved, they are resources to be used. We have learned that most situations are complex. that there are usually multiple valid viewpoints. We use our ability to hold contradictions to find creative solutions that take all perspectives into account. The research team's work was interrupted by urgent news from the outer rim of the galaxy. The Nexus Empire, a militant species known for their aggressive expansion, had made contact with human space. Their war fleets were moving toward Earth. The Nexus had studied human military capabilities and deemed them primitive. They expected an easy conquest. They had not studied the psychological effects of fighting humans. They had no idea what they were. Walking into Wailing received permission to warn the human authorities about the approaching threat. But she also knew that the coming conflict would provide the ultimate test of human psychological impact. The Nexus were known for their rigid thinking and absolute discipline. If anyone could resist human influence, it would be them. The research station went into high alert mode. They prepared to observe the first major military conflict between humans and a galactic power. What they would witness would change everything they thought they knew about warfare psychology and the nature of strength itself. Reports began filtering in from the edge of human space. The Nexus advanced scouts were returning with disturbing information. They spoke of humans who fought with unpredictable tactics, who seemed to view warfare as just another form of problem-solving, who could shift between aggressive combat and diplomatic negotiation within minutes. One scout reported encountering a human patrol ship that had offered to share their emergency supplies even while both sides were preparing for battle. Another described human soldiers who had rescued Nexus crew members from a damaged ship, then immediately returned to combat positions. The Nexus commanders were confused by these reports. They had never encountered an enemy who could be simultaneously hostile and helpful, who could fight fiercely while maintaining compassion for their opponents. As the main Nexus fleet approached Earth, the research station prepared to document what they expected would be humanity's final test. Some species could be understood through diplomacy. Others revealed their nature through trade or cultural exchange. But the Nexus only understood strength. They would force humanity to show their true nature under the ultimate pressure. Wailing watched the tactical displays with growing concern. The Nexus fleet was massive and well-armed. Humanity had been in space for less than a century. They had never faced a threat like this. But she had studied human history. She knew that humans often showed their greatest strength when facing impossible odds. The first battle reports came in, and they were unlike anything the research team had expected. The military engagement itself was fairly standard. Human forces used clever tactics to compensate for their technological disadvantages. But something else was happening. Something that defied military logic. Human commanders were sending diplomatic messages during combat. They were offering medical aid to damaged enemy ships. They were even broadcasting cultural information about Earth, as if they were still trying to establish friendly relations while fighting for their lives. Most disturbing of all for the Nexus was that these seemingly contradictory actions were actually effective. The human ability to fight and negotiate simultaneously was confusing. Nexus tactical planning, their rigid military doctrine, had no response to enemies, who could be both aggressive and peaceful. Reports from Nexus commanders began showing signs of the same psychological strain that had affected the Diplomats. They were struggling to understand opponents who seemed to operate by completely different rules. They found their own certainties being challenged by human behavior that made no logical sense. The research station documented everything, knowing they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. For the first time, a species was being forced to confront human psychological impact, not through peaceful contact but through warfare. And as the reports continued to come in, it became clear that the Nexus Empire was experiencing the same transformation that had affected every other species that encountered humanity. They were being forced to question their assumptions about strength, about warfare, about the nature of conflict itself. The humans were not just fighting a military battle. They were fighting a psychological one. And they were winning not through superior weapons but through their ability to remain completely human even under the pressure of war. The Nexus war fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Earth's solar system. Their ships were massive and deadly, built for conquest and domination. Supreme Commander Zethak stood on the bridge of his flagship studying the tactical displays. The human defenses looked pathetic compared to his overwhelming force. "This will be over quickly," he told his officers. "The humans are barely out of their primitive stage. They have no experience with real warfare." Admiral Hyun-woo received the enemy fleet detection report in his command center on Earth's moon. He looked at the tactical screen showing hundreds of Nexus warships. His own fleet was much smaller and less advanced, but he had studied every available record of alien military tactics, and he had something the Nexus did not expect. The first engagement began near Jupiter. The human fleet met the Nexus advance guard in what should have been a simple battle. The Nexus expected the humans to either fight according to standard military doctrine or surrender when they realized they were outmatched. Instead, they encountered something that broke all the rules. Human ships that were severely damaged continued fighting, but also broadcast surrender signals at the same time. Nexus commanders received messages offering to share star charts and cultural information, even as human weapons fired on their ships. Some human vessels retreated in what looked like cowardice, then suddenly turned the retreat into a devastating ambush. Captain Yoon-ji commanded the human destroyer Defiance when it was surrounded by 3 Nexus cruisers. Her ship was badly damaged and her crew was injured. Any rational commander would have surrendered. But instead of giving up, she opened communication channels with all 3 enemy ships. "This is Captain Yoon-ji of the Defiance," she broadcast to her attackers. "I want you to know that we respect your courage as warriors. Before we continue this battle, I want to share something with you." The Nexus commanders were confused. Why was a defeated enemy trying to start a conversation? This was not how warfare was supposed to work. "My ship is named after the quality of refusing to give up," she continued. "Even when everything seems hopeless. Even when you have lost everything, you keep fighting. Not because you hate your enemy, but because you have something worth protecting." One of the Nexus commanders, Kethra, could not help but respond. "What are you trying to accomplish? Human, your ship is crippled. You have no chance of victory." Yoon-ji laughed, and it was not the sound of someone who had given up. "Victory is not just about destroying your enemy," she said. "It is about staying true to what you believe in. It is about showing that some things are more important than your own survival." Before the Nexus ships could respond, the Defiance exploded in a massive blast that damaged 2 of the cruisers, but Yoon-ji had evacuated most of her crew in escape pods. Even in her final moments, she had chosen to save lives rather than simply cause destruction. The battle continued for days, and with each engagement, the Nexus commanders became more confused and frustrated. The humans fought with tactics that made no military sense. They would risk their lives to rescue enemy survivors. They would pause in the middle of combat to offer medical aid. They would send cultural transmissions, even while their ships were being destroyed. Supreme Commander Zeth Ak found himself studying reports that challenged everything he knew about warfare. His officers were beginning to question their own tactics. Some were even asking why they were fighting a species that seemed more interested in communication than conquest. The turning point came when Captain Yoon-ji was captured during a boarding action. Instead of being taken to a prison cell, she was brought directly to Zethak, who wanted to understand what kind of mind could create such confusion among his forces. "You are the human who has been causing problems. For my commanders," he said as guards brought the wounded captain before him. "Tell me why your people fight so strangely." Yoon-ji looked up at the massive alien commander, with eyes that showed pain, but no fear. "We do not fight strangely," she said. "We fight like humans." "What does that mean?" Zethak demanded. "It means we remember that our enemies are also people," she replied. "We remember that war is a tragedy even when it is necessary. We remember that the goal is not just to win, but to create a better future when the fighting is over." Zeth Ak was quiet for a moment, studying this small human who had been captured but still spoke with confidence. "How can you show compassion to enemies who are trying to kill you?" he asked. "Because if we become monsters, to defeat monsters, then the monsters have already won," Yoon-ji said simply. "We choose to remain human even in the worst circumstances, especially in the worst circumstances." Over the next several hours, Zethak found himself drawn into a conversation that challenged every assumption he had about warfare, strength, and leadership. Yunji spoke about human history, about wars they had fought among themselves, about how they had learned to build peace from the ashes of conflict. She showed him pictures, from her personal belongings, images of her hometown which had been destroyed in an ancient war, then rebuilt into something beautiful. Pictures of former enemies working together, of monuments to both victory and loss, of children playing in parks, where battles had once raged. How is this possible? Zethak asked, his voice showing confusion that had been building for days. How can you remember your enemies with respect? How can you forgive people who have hurt you? How can you fight for peace while preparing for war? Because Yunji said that is what it means to be alive. To hold all the contradictions, to embrace the complexity, to choose hope, even when you have every reason to despair. She explained how humans had learned that their greatest strength came not from avoiding their contradictions, but from embracing them. How they had discovered that wisdom came from acknowledging their capacity for both good and evil. How they had found that true courage meant choosing compassion even when hatred would be easier. We do not fight because we love war, she continued. We fight because we love what war threatens. We do not seek to destroy our enemies. We seek to protect what we cherish. We do not celebrate victory. We mourn the necessity that made victory required. Zethak found himself faced with a choice that had broken every other being who encountered humanity. He could continue his conquest and destroy a species that had shown him uncomfortable truths about the nature of existence, or he could try to understand what humans had learned about finding meaning in contradiction. The war ended, not with a great battle, but with a communication. Zethak ordered his fleet to withdraw, not because he had been defeated militarily, but because he had been forced to confront questions he was not ready to answer. Years passed and the galaxy slowly changed. The story of the Nexus withdrawal spread through space, along with reports of the psychological effect humans had on other species. No one sent traditional diplomats to Earth anymore, but not because they feared them. Instead, Earth became a destination for beings seeking to understand themselves more deeply. The humans, with their unique ability to hold contradictions without breaking, had become informal teachers to the galaxy. They helped other species work through their own internal conflicts. The Galactic Council eventually established the Earth Protocol's guidelines for species who wished to interact with humanity. The protocols acknowledged that contact with humans would likely be transformative and potentially disturbing, but also that this transformation could lead to greater wisdom and self-understanding. Humanity was inducted into the Council not as conquerors or subjects, but as teachers who had learned to find strength in their contradictions. They offered not easy answers or simple solutions, but the hard-won wisdom that growth came from facing difficult truths about oneself. Earth became known throughout the galaxy as the world where beings went to confront their own nature. The humans welcomed visitors with the same mixture of warmth and honesty that had broken so many diplomats. They offered not comfortable lies, but the challenging truth that existence was complex and that this complexity was what made life beautiful. The research station continued its work, but now it studied not just humans, but the species that had been changed by contact with them. They documented how beings learned to embrace their own contradictions, how they found new ways to resolve old conflicts, how they discovered strength in vulnerability. Whaling often stood at the station's observation deck looking out at Earth and thinking about how one small species had changed the entire galaxy. The humans had never sought to conquer or control others. They had simply remained true to their own nature, and in doing so, had forced everyone else to examine theirs. The story of why no one sends diplomats to Earth anymore became a legend told throughout the galaxy, not as a warning about a dangerous species, but as a testament to the power of embracing one's full nature, contradictions, and all. Humanity had shown the galaxy that true strength came not from perfection, but from the courage to be completely, authentically, beautifully alive. And in learning that lesson, the galaxy itself had become a richer, more complex, more hopeful place. Sometimes the greatest victory was not conquering your enemies, but helping them discover who they really were. And in that discovery, both victor and defeated found something more valuable than conquest. They found wisdom.